Today's episode is brought to you by We Break You Buy. Interested in sports cards and memorabilia? Check out We Break You Buy on TikTok. We Break You Buy is a small operation run by three brothers, offering spots for a chance at winning some incredible sports cards and memorabilia. That's We Break You Buy. Check it out today on TikTok. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Why Wasn't It Better? I am your host, Patrick Darms.
And I'm your co-host, Anton Paras.
We're back. How do I intro this? I'm so used to having a guest. There's just
Well,
no one here.
It's an old-fashioned, retro-style Pat and Anton episode. In the same theme of bringing it back, we're bringing it back to a throwback Disney film. Not like throwback, but it is set.
It's pretty old at this point.
Yeah, it's set at turn of the century, right?
Yeah, well, it's also released at the turn of another century.
That's true. So hey, a
Yeah.
couple hints there, but we're really excited to dig into this Disney film, which maybe
a proper
Pat,
Disney film.
like maybe just why don't we chat up how we even decided on going over this film first before we dig in a little bit.
Well, we can, but I think that's really going to step on why this was chosen, so I refuse to do that right now.
That's fair. I think at the end of the day, it's a really just want to throw this out there. Really cool to be able to get into more animation and more animated film, just because I love me some animated films.
I do as well. It is certainly a genre that we have neglected, although I want to correct myself because, as Brad Bird would point out, animation is not a genre. Animation can be any genre.
There we go. But not for lack of animated films that certainly haven't lived up to their hype. But I feel like when
There's
I think
so
of
many.
when I think of animated films, I just think of all the ones I love.
When you're talking about Disney, there is such a rich, long history of films to draw upon. At this point, I think they have 60-something official full-length animated releases, and that's not including Pixar. That's not including some of their other subcategories that they classify films as. They don't really do them anymore, but there was like a Disney Toons banner that they used to use to release certain sequels. And of course, it's quite muddled with some of them. Like the new CG animated remake of The Lion King was apparently not released by Walt Disney Animation Studios, but just Walt Disney Pictures. So that's where it gets confusing. But today we're talking about just a good old-fashioned animated Disney film. And I guess before we get to that, just a little bit of admin. The Patreon is coming. That's all we're going to say about it for now. We also have the ability to offer our listeners the option to support us monetarily. If you follow us on Spotify, you have the option to do so there. And we thank you for all the support that we have gotten thus far. I think that's it. I mean, you can go ahead and intro this and we can get this going.
All right. Well, folks, welcome to Atlantis, the Lost Empire. An inexperienced young adventurer becomes the key to unraveling an ancient mystery when he joins up with a group of daredevil explorers to find the legendary Lost Empire of Atlantis. A naive but determined museum cartographer, Milo Thatch, dreams of completing the quest begun by his late grandfather, a famous explorer. When a journal surfaces, an eccentric billionaire funds an expedition, and the action shifts to high gear. Released on June 15, 2001 by Walt Disney Pictures, directed by Gary Trousdale and Kirk Wise, screenplay by Tab Murphy, with additional story credits for Gary Trousdale, Kirk Wise, Bryce Zabel, Jackie Zabel, and Joss Whedon, voiced by Michael J. Fox, Cree Summer, James Garner, Leonard Nimoy, Don Novello, Phil Morris, Claudia Christian, Jacqueline Obradors, Jim Varney, Florence Stanley, John Mahoney, David Ogden Steers, and Corey Burton, with a budget of about $90 to $120 million, which is $156 to $208 million adjusted for inflation, with a box office of $186 million, so $322 million adjusted for inflation. So, Pat, why have we decided to go on this Atlantean journey?
Well, this is a sort of listener request. We had a listener write in and ask why we haven't covered a Disney movie yet. And we didn't have a good answer. And my initial reaction was, well, we have covered Disney movies. Back on season 2, we covered Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End. We also did Incredibles 2, which is, of course, a Pixar movie, which
Mhm.
is not the same thing, technically, even though Disney
That's
owns
true.
Pixar.
That's
They
true.
are released under separate banners. But this listener's pointed out that no, I'm talking about traditional Disney animated films, a real old school animated Disney flick. So, yeah, we realize this is something that we have been neglecting. We needed to cover a proper Walt Disney animation feature.
I wanted to throw something out there, maybe hand drawn is, going to be, like, a particular aspect of the process, right?
Technically, we had free range to pick from anything, but yes, I
Yeah.
wanted to pick something that was traditionally animated 2D.
Yep.
Um,
With CGI
you know,
elements, but
there's plenty of CGI elements in this film, which is
but
not a
yes.
knock.
But this is yes, this is just exciting because of, where it fits in the traditional Disney library.
Yeah. And I thought this would be a good candidate for why wasn't it better because number one, it did not do well financially. It did not do well critically. It's really not an obvious choice for anyone, right? Atlantis the Lost Empire is really nobody's favorite. It is one of the most forgotten Disney films. You mentioned
Mhm.
how this is really a throwback, and like, yeah, we're talking almost 23 years old at this point. And what I would say is if you're listening to this podcast right now and this is your favorite Disney movie, please write in and tell us why, because this is just one of those films where in the plethora of Disney films that people could talk about, right? You almost never hear this one get brought up. I think there are certainly people who fondly remember it who are probably our age, fellow millennials.
Mhm.
It does have a cult following. You can certainly go on the Disney subreddit, or there is a pretty active Disney message board that will have a lot of love for this film. But I don't know if you were just ask any casual moviegoer like what they thought of this movie. I don't even know if most people have seen it at this point. It is, of course,
Mhm.
available on Disney Plus, just like almost everything else in their library. But I actually saw this in the theater with my family. I really had to jog my memory. I didn't recall much about it. I remember not really liking it. I would have been 13 at the time. So I was at a curious age for this, which we'll get into a little bit more in the discussion of like who was this film actually marketed towards. Those who do like this film will really defend it as some kind of a forgotten masterpiece. But Anton, do you have any particular history with Atlantis: The Lost Empire?
Yeah, I mean, first off, I'm a pretty big Disney fan, so there's always going to be an extra spark of fun whenever we're talking about a Disney film on the podcast. And so going particularly to this film, I saw this film in theaters and I remember there were a lot of aspects about the film that when you see as an adult really go over your head, whether that's the action, some of the comedy, a lot of the small details. But what really stuck with me were the visuals. The fact I really like Michael J. Fox as a kid, so actually knowing that it was Milo was voiced by Michael J. Fox is something that really stuck with me forever. And what was really interesting is I still vividly remember my friends that I went to go see the film with. It was one of my, close friends, her older brother, really particularly liked this film. And I think that almost kind of hints at what kind of territory this film gets into. Because at the time I was probably closer, like what was I like, I was maybe like 9 or 10 when the film came out. But then he was in like high school. So just kind of thinking about that, where the appeal is, what appealed to who, just kind of hints at what kind of film this was. At the end of the day, like it's always really exciting to kind of go over films from this era of Disney because it's definitely one that I think is a bit underrated. I don't think that's a hot take. I do think it's a very underrated era, and I'm excited to dig in and have our listeners learn a bit more.
You're right about the era too. This was 2001. Disney was in what you would probably call today the post-Renaissance period.
Exactly. I think that's what the
And
historians officially call it.
yeah, I've heard it referred to as the wilderness era too. I don't know how official that is, but yeah, it was really a curious time for Disney because they were getting frankly pretty experimental
Mhm.
with the films that they were putting out, which is always cool just from a creativity standpoint. But financially, there was a lot of box office disappointment during this era for Disney, and this was no exception. This did not even make its budget back in North America. It had an extensive marketing campaign, which was not factored into the budget.
Nope.
And everything we know about this film is that it lost a lot of money for the studio. Regardless, I agree with you that this film is underrated. Now, my question to you is, we both saw this in the theater, so we were two of like 1,000 people that went to see it. Just
Right.
kidding. It's a little bit of an exaggeration, but how many times over the past 23 years have you watched it since?
I can't say very many. It stuck with me enough as a kid that I even went to go watch the direct to VHS sequel.
Oh, you've seen that, huh?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
How was that?
Pretty bad. I still remember it being pretty disappointed. It was like what you liked about the original, but completely watered down.
I saw it
Yeah.
pop up in my queue on Disney Plus after I watched this, and I almost put it on, but I was like, eh.
It's official canon, so if you wanna see continuation of the story, I would check it out. The only issue I have is because it was really meant to be a TV series, like TV series pilot that they never picked
Right.
up, it's just there are a lot of concepts that are half-baked. They even have, like, a cute animal that was, like, basically, like, everything that you need for an element for, like, a TV series that would be on, like, Disney Channel, but never got picked up.
Well, that's not surprising considering how, lukewarm the reception was to this film. They had a bunch of stuff planned for this that never got off the ground.
They had a bunch of stuff that never got off the ground. They had a stuff that did get off the ground that's still really surprising. But
Right.
yeah, but
Right.
we've hinted a lot. Maybe it's time to jump into this production history.
Yeah, let's do it. So the idea for this film, Atlantis: The Lost Empire, it was conceived as far back as October 1996 when producer Don Hahn and directors Gary Truesdale and Kirk Wise and screenwriter Tab Murphy, they were having lunch at a Mexican restaurant in Burbank, California. They had recently completed their work on The Hunchback of Notre Dame, another film we will be covering at some
Mhm.
point. And the producer and the directors, they wanted to keep the crew together, the Hunchback crew. They wanted to keep them together with another film with a quote Adventureland end quote setting rather than a Fantasyland setting.
Right.
Now, instead of another musical, which I think we should point out, all of the Disney films released during the 1990s were musicals. So instead of another musical, they wanted to make a film that would push Disney and themselves in a new direction. They shared their mutual love for films like the original Star Wars trilogy and Raiders of the Lost Ark, and they lamented that, quote, they just don't make them like they used to, end quote. And that gave them the inspiration for their next film, a big, fun action adventure epic film in the spirit of Indiana Jones or Star Wars. During that discussion, Don Hahn immediately came up with the idea of a group of adventurers and explorers going to the center of the earth to find something. Don Hahn is one of the biggest names in Disney. He produced many of their animated films during that era, most notably Beauty and the Beast, which earned him a Best Picture nomination at the 1992 Academy Awards. Coincidentally enough, it was also the first animated film to be nominated for Best Picture. It was a very big deal. Now, they were inspired by Jules Verne's 20 Leagues Under the Sea, in which the characters briefly visit Atlantis. And they set to make out a film that delved into the mythology of Atlantis. They grew interested in the clairvoyant readings of Edgar Cayce and decided to incorporate some of his ideas, notably that of a mother crystal, which provides power, healing, and longevity to the Atlanteans, into the story. They wanted to avoid Atlantis looking like, quote, crumbled Greek columns underwater, end quote. So they looked at Mayan architecture and others like Cambodian, Indian, and Tibetan works. The overall design and circular layout of Atlantis were based on the writings of Plato. Now, this is cool. Mark Okrand, who developed the Klingon language for the Star
Mhm.
Trek television and theatrical productions, he was hired to devise the Atlantean language, and guided by the director's concepts for a mother language, Okrand employed an Indo-European word stock with its own grammatical structure. This is a real language that he
Yep.
developed for the film, and if you'd like, you can learn it. It's
You can
it's
learn it.
just like Klingon. It's a real functioning, recognized language that you can learn. Really cool the work they put into this.
Yeah, one of the really cool details that I loved about the development of the language too is if you pay attention in the film to how the language is read, it cascades from left to right, then right to left in the same way that Atlanteans are used to the flow of water. So really fun little
That's
details.
cool.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Josh Whedon was the first writer hired, but quickly left. And according to Whedon himself, quote, not a shred, end quote, in the finished film is his. Nevertheless, he still ended up receiving a credit. Now, Tab Murphy completed the bulk of the screenplay over 3 to 4 months, and the first draft was 155 pages, so significantly longer than usual Disney scripts, which were typically around 90 pages. After realizing that the first two acts would add up to about 2 hours of runtime, the writers began cutting characters and scenes, mostly focused on Milo, and a major revision of the script eliminated the trials encountered by explorers as they navigated the caves to Atlantis, allowing the characters to reach the city faster. Now, the character of Milo J. Thatch was originally supposed to be a descendant of Edward Teach, otherwise known as Blackbeard the Pirate. Glad they didn't go in that direction. Don Hahn observed that the absence of songs presented a challenge for a team accustomed to animating musicals, as action scenes alone would have to carry the film. And this cannot be emphasized enough. This was a deliberate effort from the filmmakers to move Disney in a different direction. The crew wore t-shirts which read, quote, Atlantis, fewer songs, more explosions, end quote. Due to the film being an adventure story rather than the previous Disney movies, which were all musicals. And just quick thing on that, that's a pretty big deal, right?
Yeah, it really is. I had forgotten just how different of a turn that this was for Disney at the time. They really were trying to take things in a different direction from, the so-called Renaissance era.
Right. And I mean, just on that same note with Disney really experimenting during the time, it's been now known in history as the Renaissance. And in the 1990s, it brought the company unprecedented success, and they were beginning to see diminishing returns in the past few films. Tarzan had done well, but was expensive to produce. Hercules, Mulan, Dinosaur, The Emperor's New Groove, they performed well enough on paper, but did not meet box office expectations. Fantasia 2000 had bombed. It was a transitional period for Disney, known unofficially as, we've referenced earlier, the wilderness years, also the post-Renaissance.
And here's a quick sidebar because I this made me curious about what else was Disney doing during this period because they don't use it anymore. But back in the day,
Yeah.
Disney had a division called Touchstone Pictures, which they would use to release any content, any films that that were deemed too adult for their normal fan base, right? So anything
Right.
rated PG-13 or R, they would release under what they called Touchstone Pictures. Now, under that banner, they were doing some really interesting stuff that they would probably never do now. They were really taking, I guess you could say, risks, for lack of a better term. Like, here's just some of the live action stuff that they were putting out in the late 90s and early 2000s. The Water Boy, 10 Things I Hate About You, Summer of Sam, Runaway Bride, The Insider, Bringing Out the Dead, The 13th Warrior, Unbreakable, Gone in 60 Seconds, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, Pearl Harbor, The Royal Tenenbaums. There's just no way Disney would take this many creative risks now, which only makes their acquisition of 20th Century Fox all the more disappointing, right? Because
Yeah.
you would have expected more creativity, right, when they bought that studio, but we haven't gotten that yet. Doesn't mean we
Yeah.
won't, but so far, I mean, that list I just rattled off, Anton, like that's just a snippet of some of the stuff they're putting out. Like, do you agree? Like they don't do this kind of stuff now.
They don't. I mean, for the most part, Disney just really does play it safe nowadays. But I do want to remind listeners that The Nightmare Before Christmas, one of the most iconic Disney properties of all time, was released under the Touchstone Pictures banner. So that's
Yeah, they would
probably,
have deemed that
yeah.
too dark, I guess.
Exactly. So there was a lot of worry about releasing it under the traditional Disney studios. So I think that it's interesting because that did great in the box office and of course is a much beloved property. But for the most part, Disney plays it pretty safe nowadays.
Do you know the first PG-13 film that they released under the Disney banner?
What? Ooh, that's a fun question.
It came out in 2003.
Oh, oh shoot. Well, there goes my
They
original.
kind of had no choice. Like they kind of had to make this a Disney film. You're going to kick yourself when I tell you what it is.
2003, right?
Yeah.
Just for the sake of I don't know. Is it okay, can I guess? Is it a sequel of some sort?
No.
Oh, okay, well, go for it.
Pirates of the Caribbean: The Curse of the Black Pearl.
Well, look
You
at
know what I
me
mean?
with
They kinda
look
had
at
no
me.
choice because it was based on the ride. They kinda had to make it a
Yeah.
Disney movie, right?
Look
Yeah.
look look at me with egg on my face. Well, they kinda had to, but I'm sure they said the same thing about the Eddie Murphy Haunted Mansion film.
Which another film we're covering
Ugh.
at some point. Back to Atlantis. The film ended up directed by Gary Toosdale or Tosdale, I don't know, and Kirk Wise, both of whom had worked with Han going back to Beauty and the Beast. Now, the first animated action sequence completed during production was actually the film's original prologue. The original version featured a Viking war party using the Shepherd's Journal to find
Mhm.
Atlantis and being swiftly dispatched by the Leviathan. Towards the end of production, this was deemed as not giving viewers enough emotional involvement with the Atlanteans. The opening was replaced by the sequence depicting the destruction of Atlantis, which introduced the film from the perspective of the Atlanteans and Princess Kida. The Viking prologue was included on the DVD release as an extra feature, and it is available as an extra on Disney Plus if you want to check it out. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it was pretty neat.
Michael J. Fox was the first and only choice for the role for the voice of Milo. Fox ended up choosing this role over Titan AE on the advice of his son. Viewers have noted similarities between Milo and the film's language consultant, Mark Okrand, who developed the Atlantean language and used in the film. Okrand states that Milo's supervising animator, John Pomeroy, sketched him, claiming not to know how a linguist looked or acted. Veteran actor James Garner was cast as Rourke based on his prior experience in war films. Lloyd Bridges was originally cast as Whitmore, but he died before completing the film, and he was replaced by John Mahoney. Lloyd Bridges should be known to Seinfeld fans. He is, of course, Mandelbaum.
Yeah,
Mandelbaum.
Mendelbaum. Before we go a bit further, I wanted to kind of make a quick note about Titan AE. I would be I'd feel bad if we didn't even mention his name. Are you familiar with who directed it?
It's Don something, right?
Don Bluth,
That's it, yeah.
a legend in animation.
Another film that's on our list,
Yep.
Titan AE.
Titan AE, not not among his best, but a lot of heart. Listeners will probably know Don Bluth, of course, for The Land Before Time, An American Tale,
Yep.
All Dogs Go to Heaven. For a time, it was animated films that really went toe to toe with Disney productions.
Yeah, it's a good call out. We have a few of his films on our list. Anastasia's one. We're going to be covering
Yep.
that at some point. Yeah, a
So
lot of fun to revisit these. I have not seen Titan AE since I was probably 12 years old.
it was around that same time period was the last time I saw it. And but
Yeah.
you know, we grew up in a household that loved Disney, loved some Don Bluth. Also, there's the video game fans will recognize Don Bluth as the creator for the video games Dragon's Lair and Space Ace. So guy was all over the place, and he's still
Love it.
alive and going to conventions today.
Is he really? He's got
Yeah,
to
he
be
is.
pretty old, right?
I
Yeah,
was I
interesting.
was I was actually kicking myself. There was a convention he was at here in California, and I was thinking to get a copy of one of my games signed. I'd love to. He's a man's a legend.
Corey Burton was cast as the voice of Mole. Listeners may know him as the voice of Cad Bane in Star Wars The Clone Wars, and he also made an appearance in The Mandalorian. Thought that was cool. Corey Burton, been working for a while.
Yep.
And of course, we have Leonard Nimoy doing some voice work. Love it. I wish he did more of it. He has such a cool voice.
Yeah, it was lending his voice to this. Of course, Star Wars. That song about Bilbo Baggins.
Right? Transformers.
Transformers.
This is one of the last Disney films to feature a character smoking. I don't know if you caught that.
Yep.
It was such a interesting thing that I noticed. I'm like, smoking in a Disney film. It's like, yeah, you used to see that.
It was if I couldn't find anything to confirm it, but it was or to just that it was concrete, but it was the last animated film that I saw that had
It had to
smoking.
be. Yeah,
Yeah.
2001, this would have been the absolute tail end of that.
Yeah.
So at one time, 350 animators were working on this film. One of the designers on this film was Mike Mignola, the creator of Hellboy. His artistic influence on this film's animation style is one of the reasons why it has become a cult film. This was one of the few Disney films produced in 35mm widescreen format. Great decision on their part. In the final pull-out scene of the movie, immediately before the end title card, it was described by the directors as the most difficult scene in the entire history of Disney animation. This is where you basically see the
Mhm.
entire expanse of the Atlantean Empire.
Fun little fact about the Mike Mignola connection. When Disney actually called him to request his services on the film, the first thing he said on the phone was, "How did you get my number?" Mike Mignola, the ever skeptical. At the time of its release, Atlantis: The Lost Empire was notable for using more CGI than any other Disney traditionally animated feature. Several important scenes required heavy use of digital animation: the Leviathan, the Ulysses submarine and subpods, the heart of Atlantis, and the stone giants. James Newton Howard composed the score, approaching it as if it were live action. In the case of Atlantis, Howard wanted the sound to be completely different from the surface world and chose an Indonesian orchestral sound incorporating chimes, bells, and gongs. Now, Disney sunk a lot of money into this, and the box office return was pretty bad. It was among the company's first major attempts to utilize internet marketing, and the film was one of Disney's first marketing attempts through mobile network operators and allowed users to download games based on the film. The film was promoted through Kellogg's, which created a website with mini games and a movie-based video game giveaway for UPC labels from specifically marked packages of Atlantis breakfast cereal. So really going all out. It was the first traditionally animated Disney film to be rated PG since The Black Cauldron in 1985. Dinosaur, released the year before, was also rated PG, but to be fair, it's a 3D animated film. Despite a reported budget of $120 million, the film earned only $84 million in North America. And as it's sitting right now, hasn't done too well critically at 49% of a Rotten Tomatoes score. Responding to its disappointing box office performance, Thomas Schumacher, then president of Walt Disney Feature Animation, said, "It seemed like a good idea at the time to not do a sweet fairy tale, but we missed." This did get a direct-to-video sequel, which we talked about earlier, called Atlantis 2: Milo's Return. It was a bit of a missed opportunity there as well, but it is a canon continuation of the story, and it is available on Disney Plus. So if you're curious, check it out. A Team Atlantis television series was planned and even partially started, but was never released. And the first 3 pilot episodes were made available on DVD release for the sequel. And there's an excellent making of documentary about this movie on YouTube on the Sean Dudley channel. I think I saw the exact same video, and I highly recommend it as well.
Yeah, it's really, really thorough
So
stuff.
it was reported in 2002 that when the quote submarine voyage end quotes attraction was closed down in Disneyland, it was to reopen with the theme of this film. However, due to negative feedback from some critics combined with the film's box office returns, the idea was scrapped. Instead, that honor of the reskinning of the submarine voyage ride ended up going to Finding Nemo.
That's not surprising.
No, it's not.
That
It's
film
not.
did enormously well.
Yes. And another fun fact, we did a video game tie-in in the last episode. Atlantis: The Lost Empire did technically get video game adaptations
Did you
to
play it?
I played I think the title was Milo's Adventure, or it was I played one of them. Essentially they were both first person shooters, which I don't often think of like Disney and first person shooters in the same sentence.
No, that's a little weird. And even to involve Milo in that, like he doesn't pick up a gun in this film, as far as I remember.
No, it was more like it wasn't guns more than it was like using like
Crystals?
science fiction weapons. There was crystal energy. Um, it's
Fair.
so they were PC releases too, so it wasn't
Okay.
on console. But yeah,
Well,
we
that's
are
it. Pretty
yeah.
lengthy production history, but a rich production history. That's a really interesting one. I really loved doing the research for this one. There was a lot of stuff that was really cool to dig up.
Yeah, it's a fun one, and I think that now that a lot of folks know more about the production, why don't we go ahead and dive in? Why wasn't it better?
Number one is the box office competition. This is a category that we don't talk about often
Mm-mm.
when we cover films, but it can be a very real thing. This had some really tough competition at the box office when it was released in the summer of 2001. Anton, your favorite movie, Shrek,
Boom.
was really dominating the theaters at that point. So was Lara Croft, Tomb Raider. both of these films outperformed Atlantis pretty significantly.
I'm not gonna even acknowledge the Tomb Raider film as a true rival to Atlantis. It was Shrek all the way. Had to have been.
I think so, yeah. And, we were beginning to touch on this a little bit when we were introing the movie, but this was really released during a very transitional era for not only Disney, but animation as a whole, right? The 3D
Mhm.
revolution that began with Toy Story in 1995, it was in full swing by 2001, right? Shrek and Monsters, Inc., they were the big winners at the box office that year. And the animation studios, they weren't ready to let go of traditional 2D animation just yet. They were still throwing a lot of money at it, like we saw with this film. And that would really continue over the next couple of years, right? This movie was one of the early 2D losers in that war, right? It would eventually, we would get to the point now, 20 plus years later, where traditionally animated films barely get any attention anymore. It's not to say that some of them
Mhm.
don't do well, but almost every major animated film these days is 3D.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to kinda mention there is for the longest time, Disney, like you said, held out on tied to the more traditional animation style, but more so as technology has gotten better, more and more studios have realized it's just a more just cost-effective way of putting together a film, and for
It's
better or
cost
worse.
effective
Yeah,
and the money spoke volumes, right?
right.
The box office numbers just started to tip in 3D animation's favor. And I should call out that Disney had begun to dip its toes into the 3D world the year before this, right? With that film Dinosaur. That had
Yes.
done
Yeah.
pretty well at the box office. And of course, this is the turn of the millennium. They had not acquired Pixar yet. They were Pixar's distribution partner, but it was not until I believe
Mhm.
they purchased Pixar in 2006 or 2007.
It's 2006. Fun year.
Okay. Now, of course, this film was making extensive use of 3D CGI, right, to bolster the traditional animation to really
Mhm.
great effect. The animation in here is
Yeah.
stunning, absolutely stunning. Jeff Jensen of Entertainment Weekly, he noted that CGI films such as Shrek were more likely to attract the teenage demographic typically not interested in animation. And he called Atlantis a quote, marketing and creative gamble, end quote. Now, he was saying this back then. And I have to say, that makes a lot of sense because
Mhm.
just putting myself back in the shoes of my 13-year-old self, I saw both this and Shrek in theaters. And yeah, I remember thinking at the time, Shrek seemed so much cooler. The cutting
Yeah.
edge aspect of it, it really spoke to me and my younger sister at the time. We both enjoyed Shrek far more than we did this.
So, I will definitely say that's where, I joke a lot about how much I love Shrek, but I actually do think it's a fantastic film.
Oh, definitely. Agree.
Memes aside, there's a lot of aspects that you can look at Shrek and the way that the film was put together and, like, even compare that to Atlantis, and not to say that it's a knock on 2D animation, but just more so there was a lot in place that made it difficult for a film like Atlantis to succeed, and, we'll touch more on that, whether it's the plot itself, the amount of characters in the story, just kind of a rush job and cutting out certain parts of the story to kind of make it more cohesive versus Shrek, which is like, for all intents and purposes, a very simple story with a core like group of characters.
No, I agree with what you're saying. Like the 2D versus 3D thing, it doesn't mean one is better than the other,
Right.
but that really was the narrative at the time. The 3D stuff for people our age, it just felt cooler because it was
Yeah.
so new.
Right. It was a cutting edge. I do want to reference a film that also touched on this, where all the trailers really hyped it up. And I felt like a lot of folks were talking about how amazing it was. But the fact that the plot was so horrible really did not give this film a chance. It was Final Fantasy The Spirits Within.
Other film that we're going to cover.
And it's just, again, another example of you could use cutting edge technology to create just fantastic renderings. But again, that story, oof, nothing's going to save that
Uh,
or lack of.
I am very much looking forward to covering that. I think we're doing that next season.
Yeah.
Look at us already talking about next season, and we're barely into season 4. When it comes to Atlantis, this is another thing that struck me. I wondered if there wasn't some kind of Disney fatigue at the time, because the year prior to this in 2000, Disney had released 3 animated films. You get Dinosaur, Fantasia 2000, and The Emperor's New Groove. None of them did particularly well, except for Dinosaur. That made a good profit, but the latter two were complete bombs. And you have to wonder, like, were they diluting the brand by doing 3 films in 1 year? That's an awful lot. It's very ambitious on their part.
Now, I think one thing I did want to call out to defend Emperor's New Groove is that at the time of its release, there was a writer strike that impacted the marketing and even the momentum of the film's release. So
It's fair.
it actually didn't really even get a good chance to really market properly and then be well received by audiences.
And you could argue Fantasia was a passion project that,
That was
did that
like
have a
a
lot of box office appeal to audiences in 2000? It's
no.
debatable.
But in what's interesting is then, right, if you look at how it was received critically, it was critically received very well. But I see no, I agree with you there. I think that
3 films in 1 year is a lot.
it's a lot, but at the same time, I think Disney was very aware of this and the fact that they were going in a very distinct direction with the kinds of films they were putting out.
Definitely. And like we mentioned, they really tried to take things in a new direction with this. Also, one of the reasons I think this film failed at the box office. Does this appeal to little kids? I don't think
No.
so. It's a little too dark and mature for little kids, right? You get like a World War I era setting, you get the sci-fi Stargate stuff. It's a bit much.
It's a very complex plot, or at least it's a bit more
Mature.
it's a bit more mature, more layers than what I think a kid can really take in. I talked about this before our recording that at its core it's an adventure film, right? And
Yeah.
when I think of a Disney film that did a great job of being able to translate how do you translate an adventure film for a kid to for kids to understand well was Up. There was a lot of similarities of just like how do you put together like a band of adventurers trying to find like a goal or a treasure of some sort.
Or The Incredibles.
Incredibles. We've talked about it before. You can have like a nuanced and like deep story and still have it delivered for kids, but I think that in particular this film, it just wasn't a great job of that and it didn't translate well.
Right. And again, this is something they were trying to do, right? They made a conscious decision to not feature any cutesy animals, no cornball sing along songs, not a lot of comedic relief in this film either. There is comedy in this film, but less so than what you would used to see in those 90s films, right?
The kinds of jokes that you're getting to are going to be sometimes they're a little offbeat when I think of like punchlines. So for example, what's his name with that was the dynamite was the dynamite guy.
The Italian
Yeah,
guy.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And he would joke about there's a little bit of oregano in there. It's
Right.
like I don't think a kid's gonna get it.
Yeah, I think the Shrek comparison is one, but it was trying to be a Disney animated film for older kids or maybe adults. You mentioned the plot a little bit more complicated than what you're saying, the tone a little bit darker than what you're saying. I have this later in the notes, but we might as well mention it now. A lot of people get killed in this movie.
A
This has
lot.
an absurdly high body count
It's
for a
huge.
Disney film. I was trying to find out, like, is this the most people to ever to die on screen in a Disney film? I think it is.
It's it's
It's pretty
uh
crazy.
it's pretty dark stuff for for kids to watch, but at the end of the day, like it's a again very bold decision by the studio to just greenlight this.
Yeah, you got to respect the ambition, right? I got to say, I had a serious bout of nostalgia rewatching this last week. Not necessarily for this film itself, but just the ambition, right, of what they were trying to do. It made me really miss traditional 2D animation. It's just such a lost art at this point.
Agreed. I
There's
mean,
no way any studio would greenlight this kind of project now with this kind of budget.
I was nostalgic, seeing all the different tie-ins, the website tie-ins, the
Yeah.
different like mobile phone operator tie-ins, the video game tie-ins. It's different from what it is now, where I feel like most tie-ins are just products for consumption versus like interactive tie-ins to really garner interest.
Yeah, I really like how this film looks. A lot of thought and creativity was put into the animation, and it's so beautiful to watch. They did it in like the style of like Saturday morning cartoons, but they had this, essentially
Mhm.
a $200 million budget in today's money behind it. They used computers to enhance everything. All the backgrounds, all the action scenes, they were all enhanced with computers, and it's some of the best traditional animation that I've ever seen. I love the old school look to everything. You can thank Mike Mignola for that. The Venture Brothers really reminded me of
Great.
this in a good way.
Yeah.
I see a lot of I don't know if that was deliberate on their part, But a lot of what I see in the Venture Brothers, you can see taken from this film or this film's style of animation.
Well, so I think that there's a kind of a few things there. Now, we know the source material for, or one of the source materials for Atlantis was, of course, Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. When I think
Right.
of like that era, there was a lot of material from like kind of like pulp novels, science fiction, adventuring that heavily influence the Venture Brothers. So I'm not shocked that there's actually a lot of similarities, even just to the aesthetic.
The submarine Ulysses.
Yep.
This has become one of my favorite movie vehicles of all time. I absolutely love how this thing looks. It's so cool looking.
Absolutely agree. It's
I had forgotten about all the design, like all the vehicles in here. The sub pods that come out of the Ulysses, really cool. All of the Atlantean vehicles, they're all kind of like musical. The sounds they make, it's so just man. This
it's
this was just a visual treat to watch.
so I can you can see where it takes a lot of time to draw out all that detail and then to draw it consistently, to animate different scenes. But what was really cool just about the attention to detail there is you could see a lot of not only the exterior but the interior. So you really they
Yeah,
really have you like bring this to life, and I always thought that was just amazing how they really have characters explore that and really brought the Ulysses to life.
money was no object on this film, and
No.
it really shows. Having a big budget doesn't mean anything, but just once in a while, it's nice to watch a film like this and just see, like, wow, they weren't cheaping out on anything.
No, but at the same time, I feel like there was it was well, not it's not a knock. It's just I'm thankful that they doubled down on not going too heavy with the CGI animation because they could have.
Yeah, that's a good point. They could have. They used it appropriately. I was not surprised to see Gary Rydstrom's name in the credits. For those listeners who may not know his name, he is a sound designer. He is the guy who headed all of the sound effects work on films like Terminator 2, Jurassic Park, Titanic, Saving Private Ryan, the Star Wars prequels. He has won the Academy Award for sound mixing or sound editing 7 times. He is a 7-time Oscar winner.
That is nuts.
All the sound design work on this film is incredible to listen to. If you have a good sound system, this is a great Disney film to put on. This film had a lot of potential, Anton. You had a really good voice cast, you had some fun characters, beautiful animation, visually stunning. Really nice score from James Newton Howard. You talked a little bit in the production history about, the non-traditional music that he tried to incorporate into the score.
Hmm.
I was actually listening to the score earlier this morning, to sort of get in the mood for this recording. It's great. It's a great
Atmospheric.
score.
Very
Oh
so
yeah.
it's very intentional, right? We talked about in the production history where they wanted to really focus on touching really specific cultures in the incorporation into the score, and they did an amazing job.
Hypnotic.
Yes. Ethereal. I'll throw that
Yeah,
out
there you
there.
go. Yeah. Any of the listeners, if you're into film scores, check this one out. It's a forgotten gem. And of course, James Newton Howard, he's a legend. He's been working forever. He's put out some really great stuff over the years. This is one of his more underrated scores, I would say. Number 2 reason why this wasn't better, the story controversy. We were going to have to talk about this. So, Anton, the plot is just straight ripped off from Stargate, right?
One would one would think, because there's a lot of similarities to Stargate Atlantis,
There is,
but
which came out after
which
this,
came
I
out
will admit.
after, which came out
Yeah,
after. But
for what it's worth.
it is really interesting seeing that is definitely a point of contention.
Yeah, the plot may be lifted from something else as well. Many people noticed that this film was similar to a 1990 anime film called Nadia, The Secret of the Blue Water, particularly in its character design, setting, and story. The studio who produced that film, Gainax, reportedly only refrained from filing a plagiarism lawsuit against Disney because their parent company just simply did not want to get involved with a legal battle with Disney.
Yeah. Please go ahead. I was just gonna say.
No, no, no. Yeah, I mean, I know you have thoughts on this, so
So it's really funny if you look at, I don't know if folks have looked at like even the cover of the anime. You're thinking, well, how close could it be? Well, the main character is a bespectacled, blonde-haired young man who's a young adventurer. And then he also has with him one of his fellow adventurers is a young girl, Nadia, who girl of unknown origins that is also said to be of the Atlantean bloodline.
and he was
So
also voiced by Michael J. Fox. It's just really weird. I'm kidding. That's not true.
No, it's not true. But it is fair to say, and there has been interviews, right, with the directors for Atlantis, like, what's up with all the connections? And their response was, well, we didn't see Nadia, but it is fair to say that there's a lot of crossover because the source material that they were both drawing from was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So,
Yeah, and the
yeah.
stuff with the crystals that had pre-existed, both of them. I haven't looked too
Yeah.
much into it. I don't have a strong opinion on this. There definitely seems to be some similarities. There's also some similarities to a 1986 film called Laputa, Castle in the Sky from
Yep.
um, Hayao Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli. That was also noted at the time. That film also features magic crystals.
Yeah.
Truesdale and Wise, they both acknowledge that Miyazaki's works are a major influence on their own work. The point is, Disney itself never formally responded to any of these claims.
Wanted to kind of throw a little bit more kindling into the fire. It's not the first time there's been controversy with Disney and a lot of similarities to a Japanese or to an original anime. So even The Lion King, which has a lot of the marketing right, such an original story, had never seen anything like it before. Listeners, if you haven't checked it out, there is so many parallels to the original anime Kimbo the White Lion, and I kid you not, it's a little fishy to see how much similarities there are, and to almost claim that that no one on that team had been inspired at all from that as source material, but it is still part of that controversy. Then again, I think if anything, it just goes to show like how strongly these ideas, aesthetics really resonate for people.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know if this had any impact on the film's performance at the box office because I certainly don't remember hearing about this at the time. But like we just said, there were people that noted it. Like I said, I don't really have a strong opinion on and on this either way, but there's no way to talk about this film without mentioning this.
Right.
Number three reason why this wasn't better, the plot. I'll say this. This is a very original film for Disney. At the very least, they really were trying to do something different, right? After
Yep.
spending the previous decade making family friendly musicals, I really appreciated the effort here.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it didn't translate into financial success for them, but this was kind of par for the course for this era, right? We were getting into this earlier, but there was just a number of high profile animated box office bombs from this era, right? We had this film, The Iron Giant, Titan AE, Treasure Planet, The Road to El Dorado, Sinbad. There's a cult following for all of these films. A lot of people insist that they were all misunderstood, they're forgotten masterpieces. I'm not sure I buy into that with all of them. The Iron Giant might be the only one that I would actually call a masterpiece out of those ones.
Yeah, I feel like too when a lot of people look at that this era of animated film, there's a bit of nostalgia goggles getting put on there.
Yeah. I think plot wise, there were some things that were working against this film, right? Okay. So it has Atlantis in the title, right? Do
Right.
you agree with that?
Yes.
How much time do we actually spend in Atlantis in the film? Like
Not
in actually Atlantis?
not very much.
No. I think it seemed like less than half an hour.
And especially when you think of the runtime of the film, you don't get a ton of time in the film much at
No.
all, really.
What did it clock in at? Like an hour 40?
Hour 40, it's not nearly enough time to be able to check the list of everything that you'd want to be able to achieve from storytelling.
I agree. I think the pacing is fine. It's a well paced film, but the story really did feel glossed over. I needed more because it starts off fantastic, right? We
Mhm.
get this terrifying destruction of Atlantis. Not something I've ever seen in a Disney movie before, right? You basically see the death of potentially millions of people getting wiped out. Never seen a Disney movie start off like that. It reminded me of like an anime, actually.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. The darker tone, like, definitely it stands out. You may recall a Disney film that really stood out to me of like that's a lot of death was actually Mulan when they were discovered like the Emperor's forces like had been decimated by the Huns.
Oh, yeah, that's a
Yeah,
good call
and
out.
like
Yeah,
there
that was
was
pretty dark for a
and
Disney
that
film at
was
the time.
very dark for a Disney film, but this was on a much larger scale.
And then, of course, once our characters, once the explorers, they get to Atlantis, I think the story does kind of stall a little bit. There's giant robots, there's lava eventually in the climax, but the hot air balloon climax is pretty awesome. I found that really creative, really exciting. It's the
Mhm.
centerpiece action sequence of the film, and I do think it delivers.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think, like you said, it's not an issue with the pacing. I feel like when they storyboarded it, they really called out where do they need to be at each beat of the film.
Well, we know that there could have been and probably should have been more, right? So, in the original script written by Tab Murphy, it was over 150 pages. There was a lot more in the story that they could have done, and,
Mhm.
they didn't. There's a lot of characters in this, right? I would
Mhm.
argue there's too many supporting characters. You get the German mercenary femme fatale Helga, right?
Yep.
She's Rourke's like assistant. Rourke is, of course, the military commander who becomes the central antagonist.
Plot twist villain.
Yeah, plot twist villain that everyone saw coming. You get that guy Vinny. I think he's the demolition
That's it.
expert.
The dynamite guy.
Right. You get Doctor Sweet, who I is one of the first, if not the first, African American animated character in a Disney film. He is voiced by Phil Morris, aka Jackie Childs from Seinfeld.
Yes.
Thought that was a cool bit. He's a great character. You get Mole Guy,
Moliere, who's a mole.
pretty weird. I don't know. Did you need him? I don't know. Maybe. You get the cowboy cook. I don't think you needed him. You get the female mechanic who actually has probably one of the biggest personalities of that crew. You get old smoking lady for comedic relief who's pretty funny. And then you get the Atlanteans.
Well,
That's a
don't
lot of characters.
and
Oh,
don't
there's
forget
more.
the
Yeah.
eccentric billionaire.
Right. Who's in the beginning and the end.
Yeah.
That is a lot of characters for a 90-minute story, or a little bit over 90 minutes. But they needed to cut some out there. That's either
Part
cut
of
out some characters or just make the film 20 minutes longer.
So it's part of why they wanted to be, or they were being ambitious, and I have a lot of respect for wanting to include like such an animated group of characters, but like I agree with you, why bother putting them in if you're not going to have us really invest time in understanding these characters or really flesh them out more to be a bit
Right.
more material than we're just mercenaries doing it for the money.
Some of the rushed writing, right? The part that stuck out to me the most was the moment where Rourke and literally the entire team turn on Milo, right? They draw
Yeah.
guns on him
Yeah.
and they're like, we're going to steal the heart of Atlantis. Even the characters who Milo has befriended, they instantly turn on him. Only the doc,
Hmm.
Phil Morris, Jackie Childs, he's the only one to show any kind of reluctance. He doesn't really want to side with Rourke. And even
Hmm.
then, when Rourke starts beating up, King Leonard Nimoy, he kind of just goes with the flow. But then in another heel turn, all of the characters just decide to join Milo and the Atlanteans again. It happens really quickly and it comes almost out of nowhere.
Yeah, and like we said, why bother putting in all these characters if you're just going to use them to move the plot along in a way that kind of undermines any investment to the core of these characters?
Right. And then, they're bullying him on the journey to Atlantis, then they just stop. They're like, we should probably not bully him anymore. He's making a lot, Milo, he's making a lot of mistakes. I think
Huey, you
it's
want a treat?
you're not on
Sorry,
mute.
I realized I didn't put it on mute. I turned off my camera,
That's
and now,
okay.
and now it's on a recording. Huey, get over here. Sorry.
It's okay. Anton's dealing with a puppy for all of the listeners who may be curious.
Yes, I'm dealing with a puppy. He's biting something he shouldn't. I'm so sorry. He was sleeping, but then he woke up like the Leviathan.
That was a cool part. The Leviathan attack.
Yeah.
Man, that submarine, the Ulysses, it gets destroyed pretty quickly, and they're all kind of just unfazed by it.
Yeah, I mean, again,
It's
probably another
yeah, a
interesting
little
thing.
rushed, a little chopped up story there. What did you think of Michael J. Fox as Milo?
I'm a big fan of Michael J. Fox, so I'm always very biased. But I will admit, like, I can see people's criticisms of like it not being like the best performance.
I think his voice acting was fine.
But he's not a traditional voice actor.
He's not. I don't know about the character either. He's kind of he's like a pariah in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
You're kind of wondering, like, when is this guy going to do something that we can root for? He eventually comes along. I don't know what Princess Kita sees in him, though. I guess she didn't have a lot of options after, 8,000 years underground.
I think it was also really interesting when looking at when even just looking at that entire cast and crew. One of the most important things when you have a cast like that, or when you have a crew like that, a key component is the chemistry, right? And because of the way that the story was paced, or the way that the story was told, there weren't too many opportunities to be able to really get a sense of that chemistry as well. Now, it was a very conscious decision to not include like songs in the film, because that would have detracted even more from the opportunity to be able to have the crew be connected. So I think
Yeah.
that the directors knew what challenges they faced and they tried their best. It just didn't execute as well as they probably would have wanted.
Yeah, we said there's nothing wrong with the pacing. Now that I'm thinking about it more, there is. It's paced too quickly. It feels
Yeah.
chopped up in parts.
For an hour and 40-minute film, I can definitely see how if you're moving it too quickly, you have less room for character development, or really even
Yeah.
just to unravel a story in like a natural way. Maybe I can see that actually. Yeah.
I think there was two things that they could have done. Either make the film longer or cut out some of the characters. They did neither. They tried to compromise and they got caught in like this halfway house a little bit. And then there's some questions I have about the plot, right? We're just taking it for what it's worth that all the Atlanteans can speak English because they're like, well, it's the mother language. It's like that doesn't really explain
Yeah.
how they can speak English, but okay, it's a movie. I get it. You have to do that. Nobody wants to watch subtitles in a Disney film.
If there was ever going to be a part where we'll just take it as like, sure, why not? At least
Sure.
that part.
The one thing that kind of bothered me, Kita is 8,000 years old and she is this clueless. In fact, they're all clueless. Like you would just think after 8,000 years, someone would have plugged in the crystal and turned the dial the right way on one of the vehicles. 8,000 years. Or someone would have learned to read or something. None of
It's
them knew how to read their own language.
it's a very lazy storytelling.
Yeah. It wasn't like, oh, we've been stuck down here for a few months. We're screwed. It's like, no, 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 no. We've been down here 8,000 years or 6,000 years, however many thousands of years it was. They didn't even know how to read.
But once Milo comes along, Kita's like, "Well, I haven't seen you in 6,000. Where have you
That's
been?
right. He's got that magic crystal.
Where have you been for thousands of years?"
She is in many ways the most important character of the story, right? She ends up going, full Super Saiyan.
That's true. That's a
Which
good.
again, that kind of comes out of nowhere too. And then King Leonard Nimoy was like your mother, you've been chosen, and that's just it. Plot resolved. But it did give us a really cool climax with all those robot statues. And when they were creating the energy shield, it was pretty cool.
Yeah, I think I did appreciate the choreography and building the battle scenes, or just so like there's so much going on the screen where you can see that it was, I think, very advantageous to be able to use a CGI to either fix things as they're doing that, maybe even make the production of it smoother. I think it was a very impressive feat.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a shame. They needed more time to develop that story. They rush in and they rush out.
They rush in, they rush out, and we get a film like Atlantis, which, for all intents and purposes, like I think a very ambitious film.
Absolutely. I don't have anything to add in terms of the reasons. Go. If you don't either, we can wrap this up.
Let's do it. Let's jump right in.
So, really fun movie. Rarely do we get something with this sort of visual look and story, right? It is absolutely a unique film in the Disney library, particularly for that time period. It represented just a risk that Disney was willing to take, storytelling wise. It's a very flawed film. I think the story needed a lot more. There were too many characters. Everything just felt rushed. But what does work works, which is the visuals. The action sequences in this film, which they placed a lot of emphasis on, are really well done. The entire aesthetic to the film looks great. All of the design elements, not just the animation itself, but the production design, right? The characters, the vehicles, the architecture, the settings. They absolutely nailed all of that. You can tell that they spared no expense. I mean, they also had, the inventor of the Klingon language invent a language for this film. So that really speaks to the level of effort and, just money that Disney was willing to invest in this project. All of that stuff is successful. I think the voice cast is pretty good. We had a, relatively likable protagonist. You had a pretty, I'd say pretty standard villain, in the pantheon of Disney villains. Commander Rourke is certainly not in it, but James Garner, he does a good job there. And last but not least, you get a really good score from James Newton Howard. This film has a lot of things working in its favor, and it really is a shame that the story is so rushed. It does feel incomplete to me. Some of the scenes and some of the dialogue are just, it feels chopped up and clunky. This story really could have been a miniseries. I think you alluded to that a bit earlier. Maybe Disney should do that. I've heard rumors that they might be considering something live action. They might put Spider-Man and his girlfriend in it. Who knows? But they probably won't do that, because if this film was that expensive 20 years ago as an animated film, I can't even imagine what this would cost in today's money if they did it live action, because this movie flopped then. There's probably not a lot of financial incentive for them to do so. I can understand why this film didn't do well at the box office. It's certainly not a Disney classic, but I do think it's a solid movie to watch, especially if you have kids. I watched this with my wife's sister's family, our nieces. The kids absolutely loved it. We had a great time watching this. I rate this a C+. I think it's pretty good.
Very well said, Pat. I think very fair on all points. I think I mentioned this earlier, and I just want to double down on this statement. It's a very ambitious film. I've already stated I'm a huge fan of animated films. The medium, I think, it allows directors, story writers to be able to tell their stories in a way that it sometimes isn't possible with live action. And I see this actually as there was a vision for what could have been an adventurer style, like almost Indiana Jones, classic adventure style film, but then use the medium of animation to be able to just do the things that you couldn't be able to do in real life. And in doing so, also explore a lot of very ambitious goals of going into a new world and putting together a very unique and colorful crew to be able to tell that story with. And I think it's with that ambition that I think this movie has a lot of heart. I think that more folks should tune in and check out this film if they already haven't, because this is a very brave and very just unique era. I mean, the post-Renaissance is, I think, very underrated. This is not the last film that we're going to be going over in the post-Renaissance era. I think that you'll agree, listeners, that there's a lot of commonalities around the type of what kinds of stories that are being chosen, and how the different directors and teams decide to want to tell those very ambitious stories. And I think just like any film that goes against the grain, you have to applaud them when you can see the potential, you can see that there's a very conscious decision to do something fun. But at the end of the day, I think that it was the pacing, the issues with the story, it's the story with the issue itself not being able to allow to really flesh out a connection to the characters or the plot, that really did it a disservice. And also just the tone of the film just maybe didn't resonate with kids at the time. I think that if you have a chance, go check out Disney Plus, watch this film, and I'm sure you'll agree you will appreciate it for what it is. And I put this at a C+ as well.
Yeah, I definitely recommend it as well. It's definitely worth checking out if you haven't seen it, or if you haven't seen it in a long time and you're curious about revisiting it. It certainly fits that bill. Well, Anton, that is it for Atlantis: The Lost Empire. We will be returning to the Disney library in the future. Hopefully it won't take too long, because this was a lot of fun to talk about.
Yeah, Disney has such a rich history, and it's all of the fun tie-ins too. That's not something that's unique for any Disney film. I did want to shout out real quick, the character of Cookie was voiced by Jim Varney, who is a lot of folks may remember from from the Ernest movies. He was the original voice for the Slinky the dog in Toy Story, and this was his last film. I don't know if a lot of folks knew that. So just kind of it was a very touching tribute that they dedicated this film to him. One that I wanted to also just share, because I know a lot of folks also have a very strong appreciation for the Toy Story film and Slinky.
It's a good shout. Yeah, I think he passed away of cancer before this film came out. Well, that is it for this week's edition of Why Wasn't It Better? Anton, we have a big one for next week.
Yes, we do.
We're going to be doing another double feature, which we previously experimented with last season when we covered Thunderball and Never Say Never Again back to back. We're going to go back to the superhero genre. We're going to be covering both Hulk films in a
Oh,
row.
oh man.
2003's Hulk, directed by Ang Lee, followed by the 2008 MCU film, The Incredible Hulk. Those are the next two episodes that listeners can expect to hear.
Well, listeners, get ready for us to Hulk out, and here we go.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting.
Well, Pat, it's always a pleasure. I can't wait till the next episode. I always love recording with you, and I'm sure it'll be just as much, if not even more fun talking about these Hulk films.
Maybe. All right. Well, we will see you next time on Why Wasn't It Better?